The harmattan wind swept through the dusty streets of Benin City, carried with the familiar scent of roasted plantain and the distant hum of generators. Uche Okafor sat hunched over his textbook in the cramped sitting room of their family bungalow, the yellow light from a single bulb casting long shadows across the pages of his mathematics textbook. The WAEC examinations were just 3 months away, and the weight of expectation pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy yoke. His mother, Mama Uche, bustled around the kitchen preparing dinner, occasionally glancing at her son with worried eyes. She had sacrificed so much to keep him in school, working double shifts at the local hospital, selling her jewelry, even borrowing money from relatives. The shame of failure would not just be his alone to bear. His father had died when Uche was 12, leaving behind dreams of seeing his son become a doctor or engineer. Now, at 17, Uche felt the crushing responsibility of those dreams. "Uche, come and eat," his mother called, her voice tinged with the exhaustion of another long day. But Uche barely heard her, his mind racing through formulas and equations that seemed to slip away like water through his fingers. His younger sister Adiz danced around the room, humming a popular Afrobeat song, her carefree laughter a stark contrast to his mounting anxiety. How he envied her innocence, her freedom from the burden of academic expectations that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. If you were Uche, carrying the dreams of your family on your shoulders, what would you do? Think about it and let me know in the comments. Uche had always been the brightest student in his class at Unity Secondary School. Teachers often praised his quick wit and natural intelligence, predicting great things for his future. But brilliance, he was learning, was not enough. The WAC syllabus was vast, requiring months of dedicated study and practice. Mathematics, physics, chemistry, English, economics. Each subject demanded attention he felt he couldn't spare. His best friend Emeka often found him staring out a classroom window during lessons, lost in thought. "Guy, you dey worry too much," Emeka would say in pidgin English, trying to lighten the mood. "You sabi book past all of us for this class." But Uche knew that knowing and remembering under pressure were two different things entirely. The stories of brilliant students who had failed WAC haunted him, tales whispered in school corridors about those whose dreams had crumbled despite their intelligence. The problem wasn't that Uche couldn't understand the concepts. It was that he wanted success immediately. When he struggled with a particularly difficult chemistry equation, frustration would overwhelm him. When English comprehension passages seemed to mock his understanding, impatience would drive him to abandon his studies altogether. He wanted to excel, but he wanted it now, without the grinding hours of repetition and practice that true mastery required. This impatience, like a poison in his veins, was slowly eroding his confidence and pushing him toward choices he would later regret. It was during one of his increasingly frequent study breaks that Uche first heard about Baba Ogun. He had wandered to the local beer parlor, where some of the older boys from his neighborhood gathered after school. The conversation drifted from football to girls, and then, inevitably, to the upcoming WAC examinations. That's when Kelechi, a boy who had repeated his final year twice, leaned in with a conspiratorial whisper. "I know where you can get something that will guarantee success," Kelechi said, his eyes darting around to ensure no one else was listening. "There's this herbalist near Sapil Road. They say he has charms that can make you remember everything, make you smart like computer." The other boys laughed nervously, but Uche found himself listening intently. Kelechi continued, describing how several students had visited Baba Ogun before their examinations and emerged with perfect scores. Uche's rational mind rejected such superstitions immediately. He had been raised by educated parents who believed in hard work and preparation. His mother often quoted the proverb, "What the hands work for, the mouth will eat with pride." But as the days passed and his anxiety mounted, Kelechi's words echoed in his mind. The idea of a shortcut, of bypassing months of grueling study, began to take root in his consciousness like a seed in fertile soil. What if there was an easier way? What if the desperation he felt could be alleviated by something beyond conventional wisdom? The thought was both terrifying and seductive. Do you believe in shortcuts to success, or do you think hard work always wins? Comment shortcut if you'd be tempted, or hard work if you'd resist. The evening meal, had become a silent affair in the Okafor household. Mama Uche watched her son push his rice and stew around his plate, barely eating enough to sustain a growing teenager. Dark circles had formed under his eyes, and his usually vibrant personality had dimmed to a worried shadow of its former self. Adiz, now 13 and increasingly aware of the tension in their home, had stopped her cheerful singing around her brother. "Uche, you are killing yourself with worry," his mother said gently one evening, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Your father, God rest his soul, wanted you to succeed, but not at the cost of your health." Her words were meant to comfort, but they only added to the weight pressing down on him. How could he explain that every moment he spent relaxing felt like a betrayal of his father's memory? How could he tell her that his classmates seemed to grasp concepts effortlessly while he struggled? The following day at school, Uche overheard his economics teacher, Mr. Adebayo, speaking to a colleague about the upcoming examinations. "These children don't understand the competition they face," Mr. Adebayo said, shaking his head. "Only the top 15% will get the grades needed for university admission. The rest will have to find other paths." The words hit Uche like a physical blow. Other paths. What did that mean for someone whose entire family's hopes rested on his academic success? The conversation he had overheard about Baba Ogun began to seem less like superstition and more like a lifeline in an ocean of academic uncertainty. 3 weeks before the WAEC examinations, Uche made his decision. It came during a particularly frustrating study session, when he found himself unable to solve a series of physics problems that he had understood perfectly just days before. The stress was affecting his memory, creating a vicious cycle where anxiety impaired his learning, which increased his anxiety further. He slammed his textbook shut and stared at the ceiling, feeling utterly defeated. That night, he lay awake listening to the sounds of Benin City settling into sleep, the distant rumble of late-night Danfo buses, the call of night watchmen, the gentle snoring of his sister in the next room. The decision crystallized in his mind with startling clarity. He would visit Baba Ogun. It wasn't that he believed completely in charms and magic, but rather that he was willing to try anything that might give him an edge. Just once, he told himself, just to see if there was any truth to the stories. The next morning, Uche told his mother he was going to the library for extra study time. The lie felt heavy on his tongue, but desperation had made him willing to compromise his usual honesty. He dressed carefully in his best shirt and trousers, as if he were going to church rather than to seek supernatural assistance. As he walked towards Sapil Road, his heart pounded with a mixture of fear and hope. Part of him prayed that he wouldn't find the herbalist, that this moment of weakness would pass without consequence. But a larger part, the part driven by months of mounting pressure, urged him forward toward what seemed like salvation. The herbalist compound sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, hidden behind a cluster of towering irako trees that seemed to block out even the harsh afternoon sun. Uche approached the weathered wooden gate with trembling hands, nearly turning back 3 times before finally pushing it open. The compound was larger than he had expected, with several small buildings arranged around a central courtyard where medicinal plants grew in wild abundance. Baba Ogun himself was not what Uche had imagined. Instead of the wild-eyed, dramatically dressed figure of popular imagination, he found a neat, elderly man in a simple white agbada, sitting peacefully under a large mango tree. His presence was calming, almost grandfatherly, which somehow made the situation feel even more surreal. When he looked up at Uche's approach, his eyes held a depth that seemed to see beyond the surface of things. "Young man," Baba Ogun said in accented English mixed with Edo, "you have come seeking help with your examinations." It wasn't a question. Uche nodded, suddenly feeling foolish or believing that his desperation wasn't written clearly across his face. The herbalist gestured for him to sit on a low wooden stool. "Many students come to me with the same request. They want knowledge without wisdom, success without sacrifice. Tell me, what are you willing to give for what you seek?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implications that Uche didn't yet understand. All he knew was that he needed to pass his examinations, and this strange, peaceful man might hold the key to his future. Baba Ogun listened patiently as Uche poured out his fears and frustrations, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to explain his desperation. The herbalist nodded sympathetically, occasionally asking gentle questions about Uche's family, his studies, his dreams for the future. The conversation felt more like a counseling session than a negotiation for supernatural assistance, which put Uche somewhat at ease. "You are intelligent," Baba Ogun finally said, after Uche had exhausted his explanations. "But intelligence without discipline is like a sharp knife without a handle, dangerous to the one who wields it." He reached into a leather pouch that hung from his waist and withdrew a small, smooth stone that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. "This charm will help you with your examinations. Every question you answer correctly will unlock the knowledge you need for next. But remember, young man, everything has a price." Uche stared at the stone, which felt warm in his palm and seemed to pulse with energy. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was nonsense, that stones couldn't contain knowledge or power. But the desperate part, the part that had driven him here, whispered that it didn't matter whether it was real or not. If it gave him confidence, if it helped to believe in his own abilities, wasn't that worth something? He asked about the price, expecting to be told about money or favors. Baba Ogun's response chilled him. "The price will reveal itself when the time comes. For now, young man, go and prepare for your examinations. But remember, wisdom cannot be bought, only earned." The morning of the first WAEC examination dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp air that comes after a night of harmattan winds. Uche woke early, the charm tucked safely in his shirt pocket, where it had rested for the past 2 weeks. During that time, he had continued studying, but with a newfound confidence that puzzled his family. His mother attributed it to their nightly prayers. Adiz was just happy to have her cheerful brother back. At Unity Secondary School, the atmosphere was electric with nervous energy. Students clustered in small groups, conducting last-minute reviews and sharing anxious whispers about the upcoming mathematics paper. Uche's classmate Blessing approached him with wide, worried eyes. "Uche, I couldn't sleep last night. I kept having nightmares about forgetting everything the moment I entered the examination hall." Uche wanted to reassure her, but the charm in his pocket felt like a secret burden that separated him from his classmates' honest anxiety. As they filed into the examination hall, Uche touched the charm one last time. It felt warm against his fingers, and he could swear he felt a gentle pulse of energy. The invigilator, a stern-looking woman from another school, distributed the question papers with military precision. "You have 3 hours," she announced. "Begin now." Uche turned over his paper and felt his heart skip a beat. The questions, which would have terrified him weeks ago, now seemed manageable, almost familiar. The first multiple-choice question about algebraic equations looked as clear as his own handwriting. He marked option C with confidence and moved to the next question, unaware that with that single mark, his journey into an unexpected darkness had begun. The mathematics examination went better than Uche had ever dared hope. Question after question seemed to unlock itself before his eyes, as if the answers were being whispered directly into his mind. He completed the multiple-choice section in record time and tackled the theory questions with unprecedented confidence. When the 3 hours ended, he felt exhilarated, almost invincible. His classmates gathered around him afterward, marveling at his obvious confidence. "Guy, you finished that exam like say not joke," Emeka said, shaking his head in amazement. "When did you eat this morning?" Uche laughed, attributing his success to intensive preparation and good rest. But as he walked home through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, he began to notice something strange. He couldn't remember what song Adiz had been humming that morning at breakfast. In fact, he couldn't remember her humming at all lately, though he was certain she'd been doing so just that morning. The realization hit him gradually, like the slow onset of fever. By the time he reached home, he knew with growing certainty that something was wrong. Adiz greeted him at the door with her usual enthusiasm, chattering about her day at school. But when she began humming her favorite song while setting the table for dinner, the melody sounded completely foreign to his ears. He knew he should recognize it. There was a familiar ache in his chest that suggested the song had once meant something to him. But the memory was simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. That night, as he lay in bed clutching the charm, Uche wondered if his success had come at a price he hadn't anticipated. But with chemistry the next day, he pushed the worry aside, telling himself that one lost memory was a small price to pay for academic success. If this part broke your heart like it broke mine, hit that like button so more people can hear Uche's story. The chemistry examination followed the same pattern as mathematics. Questions that should have been challenging seemed to answer themselves, and Uche found himself completing the paper with time to spare. His confidence soared with each correct answer he was certain he had marked. But by the afternoon, another memory had vanished. This time, it was a taste of his mother's pepper soup, a recipe she had learned from her own mother and had been perfecting for 20 years. That evening, when Mama Uche served the soup that had always been Uche's favorite comfort food, he stared at the bowl in confusion. The spicy aroma that should have triggered anticipation and joy instead left him feeling empty. The taste, when he finally forced himself to take a spoonful, was pleasant but utterly unfamiliar. His mother noticed his lack of enthusiasm immediately. "Uche, you are not eating your soup. Are you feeling well?" she asked, concern creasing her forehead. He wanted to tell her about the strange disconnection he felt, but how could he explain that he no longer remembered why this particular dish had always made him feel loved and cherished? Instead, he mumbled something about examination stress affecting his appetite and forced himself to finish the bowl, each spoonful tasting like the cooking of a stranger. That night, Uche examined the charm more carefully. In the lamplight, it seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. For the first time since obtaining it, he felt afraid rather than grateful. 2 examinations, 2 lost memories. The pattern was becoming undeniable. But with physics scheduled for the following day, and knowing how much was at stake, he couldn't bring himself to abandon the charm now. Success was within his grasp. Surely a few lost memories were a reasonable price to pay for his family's future. The physics examination continued the disturbing trend. Complex calculations involving motion and energy seemed to solve themselves in Uche's mind, and he watched his pen move across the answer sheet with almost supernatural certainty. But even as he reveled in his newfound academic prowess, a growing dread settled in his stomach. What memory would be sacrificed this time? What piece of his identity would vanish to make room for correct answers? The loss revealed itself during lunch break. Emeka was excitedly discussing their plans for the upcoming school party, mentioning how they had spent hours last term learning the latest dance moves. "Remember that day we practiced until our legs nearly fell off?" Emeka laughed. "You were so determined to master that difficult sequence." Uche stared at his friend blankly, searching his mind for any trace of the memory. The harder he tried to remember, the more certain he became that the experience had been completely erased from his consciousness. Walking home after the examination, Uche felt like a stranger in his own life. How many memories had he already lost without noticing? How many moments of joy, learning, and connection had been sacrificed for academic success? The charm in his pocket felt heavier now, like a stone of accusation rather than assistance. He thought about his sister's laughter, which he could no longer hear in his mind, and his mother's cooking, which no longer triggered the warm associations of childhood comfort. That evening, as his family celebrated his obvious confidence about the examinations, Uche felt increasingly isolated. They were praising a success built on the systematic destruction of the very memories that made him who he was. The irony was bitter. He was gaining academic achievement by losing the experiences that had shaped his mind and character. For the first time since visiting Baba Ogun, he seriously considered abandoning the charm. But with English and economics still to come, the fear of failure still outweighed his growing horror at the price he was paying. Unable to sleep, Uche crept out of the house in the early hours of the morning before his English examination. The streets of Benin City were quiet except for the occasional night watchman's whistle and the distant sound of early morning prayers from the local mosque. He needed to see Baba Ogun again, to understand what was happening to him, and possibly to stop it before he lost more of himself. The herbalist compound looked different in the pale pre-dawn light, more mysterious and less welcoming than it had during his first visit. Baba Ogun was awake, as if he had been expecting Uche's return. He sat in the same spot under the mango tree, but now his eyes held a knowing sadness that made Uche's heart race with fear and recognition. "You have come back," the herbalist said simply. "You have discovered the price of the charm." Uche poured out his fears, describing the lost memories and the growing emptiness he felt. Baba Ogun listened without surprise, occasionally nodding as if confirming details of a story he already knew. When Uche finished speaking, the old man was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Young man, memory is not just storage, it is identity. Every moment you cannot remember is a piece of yourself that no longer exists. The charm gives you knowledge, but it takes wisdom. It grants you answers, but steals your experiences." Baba Ogun's words fell like hammer blows on Uche's consciousness. Knowledge without memory is like a tree without roots. It may appear strong, but it cannot withstand the storms of life. The herbalist reached for the leather pouch at his waist, but Uche stepped back, suddenly afraid of what else the old man might offer or reveal. With English starting in just a few hours, he fled back into the dawning day, more confused and frightened than when he had arrived. Sitting in the examination hall with the English paper before him, Uche felt the familiar pull of the charm's power. The comprehension passages seemed to unlock their meanings effortlessly, and the essay topics appeared to organize themselves in his mind with supernatural clarity. But now, knowing the price each correct answer demanded, every mark he made on the paper felt like a small betrayal of himself. He found himself hesitating before answering questions he knew were correct, wrestling with an impossible choice. Fail the examination and disappoint everyone who believed in him, or succeed and lose more of the memories that made him human. The other students around him worked with intense concentration, completely unaware of the internal battle raging in the mind of the boy they considered the smartest in their class. Halfway through the examination, Uche made a decision that surprised even himself. He began deliberately marking wrong answers for some of the multiple-choice questions, choosing options he knew were incorrect. It was a form of self-sabotage that went against every instinct he possessed, but he couldn't bear the thought of losing more memories. Each wrong answer felt like a small act of rebellion against the charm's power, a way of protecting what remained of his true self. By the end of 3 hours, Uche had created a mixture of correct and incorrect responses that reflected his internal conflict rather than his actual knowledge. Walking out of the examination hall, he felt neither the elation of his previous successes nor the despair of obvious failure. Instead, he experienced a strange sense of relief, as if he had finally begun to fight back against forces he didn't fully understand. But with economics still remaining, his battle with the charm was far from over. The economics examination was scheduled for the following day, giving Uche a sleepless night to contemplate his situation. He spent hours holding the charm, feeling its warm pulse against his palm, knowing that tomorrow would likely be his last chance to achieve the academic success his family desperately needed. The weight of their expectations pressed down on him even as he realized how much of himself he had already sacrificed. Adiz found him sitting in the courtyard at dawn, staring at the lightening sky with hollow eyes. "Brother, you look tired," she said, settling beside him with the unconscious ease of sibling affection. "Are you worried about today's exam?" Her voice carried a melody he could no longer remember, and her laughter, when it came, sounded like music from another person's life. The realization that he was becoming a stranger to his own sister's joy filled him with an ache deeper than any academic failure could cause. "Adiz," he said carefully, "sing that song you always hum, the one that makes you so happy." She looked at him strangely, as if surprised by the request, but began to sing a popular Afrobeats melody. Uche listened intently, trying to will the memory back into existence, but the song remained foreign to his ears. The disconnect between knowing he should remember and being unable to do so was like a physical pain in his chest. In the examination hall, Uche sat before his economics paper with the charm burning like a coal in his pocket. The questions appeared as clearly answerable as all the others had been, but now he understood that each correct response would steal another piece of his identity. As his classmates bent over their papers with determination, Uche faced the hardest decision of his young life. Choose certain academic success at the cost of his soul, or choose uncertainty while preserving what remained of himself. Midway through the economics examination, Uche experienced a moment of clarity that changed everything. He had been mechanically answering questions, allowing the charm's power to guide his responses, when suddenly he realized he could no longer remember his father's face. The man who had inspired his academic ambitions, whose memory had driven him to seek supernatural assistance, had been erased from his consciousness as payment for correct answers. The pen fell from his trembling fingers, clattering onto the desk with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet examination hall. Several students looked up at him with concern, but Uche barely noticed. He was frantically searching his mind for any trace of his father. The sound of his voice, the feeling of his hand on Uche's shoulder, the stories he used to tell about his own educational struggles. Nothing remained except a painful emptiness where love and inspiration had once resided. Without conscious thought, Uche stood up from his desk, ignoring the invigilator's sharp question about his intentions. He walked deliberately to the front of the room, placed his answer sheet on the supervisor's desk, and announced in a voice that carried across the entire hall, "I cannot continue this examination." The room erupted in whispers and concerned murmurs, but Uche was already walking toward the door, pulling the charm from his pocket as he moved. In the schoolyard, surrounded by the familiar sounds of Benin city life, Uche held the charm up to the sunlight. It pulsed with malevolent beauty, warm and seductive in his palm. But now he could see it for what it truly was, not a tool for success, but a thief of identity, a destroyer of the very memories that made achievement meaningful. With a cry that came from the depths of his soul, he hurled the charm against the concrete wall of the school building, watching it shatter into countless glittering fragments that caught the light like tears before settling into the dust. The journey back to Baba Ogun's compound felt different this time. Not the desperate pilgrimage of a student seeking supernatural aid, but the determined march of a young man ready to confront the consequences of his choices. Uche's mind felt clearer than it had in weeks, even though vast portions of his memory remained frustratingly blank. The charm's destruction had not restored what was lost, but had stopped the hemorrhaging of his identity. Baba Ogun was waiting for him, as if the old man had sensed the charm's destruction across the distance. His expression held neither surprise nor judgment, only a deep sadness that seemed to encompass all the students who had made similar choices over the years. "You have learned," he said simply as Uche approached. "But learning and understanding are not the same thing. I want my memories back," Uche said, his voice carrying a desperation that made the words sound more like a plea than a demand. "I want to remember my father's face, my sister's songs, my mother's cooking. I want to remember the boy I was before I came to you." Baba Ogun shook his head slowly, and Uche felt his heart sink even as he had expected this response. "Young man, memory is not a commodity that can be bought and sold, returned and exchanged. What the charm took cannot be restored by my power or any power in this world." The herbalist's words carried the weight of absolute truth. But understanding can be gained and wisdom can be earned. The memories you have lost were the price of a lesson many refuse to learn. That true success must be built on a foundation of who you are, not purchased at the cost of who you were. The walk to the principal's office felt like the longest journey of Uche's life. Each step carried the weight of anticipated disappointment, shame, and the knowledge that he was about to destroy the academic reputation he had worked years to build. Students and teachers alike stared at him with curiosity as he passed through the corridors. Word had already spread about his dramatic exit from the economics examination. Principal Adagoke, a dignified woman in her 50s who had known Uche since his first year at Unity Secondary School, received him with the patient expression of someone accustomed to dealing with teenage crises. But as Uche began to tell his story, the pressure, the desperation, the charm, and the devastating price he had paid for temporary success, her expression shifted from patience to alarm and finally to deep concern. "Uche," she said when he finished speaking, "what you are telling me is that you obtained assistance through supernatural means for your WAEC examinations?" The question forced him to confront the full absurdity of his situation. How could he explain that he had traded his memories for correct answers? How could he make anyone understand the reality of what he had experienced? Yet somehow, Principal Adagoke listened without dismissing his claims as teenage fantasy or stress-induced delusion. After a long silence, she spoke again. "Whether what you experienced was supernatural or psychological, the important thing is that you recognize you received unfair assistance and want to make it right. That shows character. Uche, that shows the kind of person your parents raised you to be. Her words carried both disappointment and pride, and Uche felt tears he had been holding back for weeks finally begin to fall. The path forward would be difficult, but at least he would walk it with integrity intact. The decision to retake the WAEC examinations meant waiting another year, a prospect that felt simultaneously devastating and liberating. Uche's mother received the news with surprising grace, her disappointment tempered by pride in her son's honesty. "Your father always said that a man's character is more important than his achievements," she told him that evening. "You have shown today that you are your father's son." Adiz, though too young to fully understand what had happened, sensed the weight of the moment. She began singing more often around the house, as if trying to fill the silence left by her brother's lost memories with new melodies. Uche found himself listening intently to her voice, trying to rebuild associations between her songs and feelings of joy, even though the original connections had been severed forever. The hardest part was facing his classmates, many of whom would soon receive their results and move on to university, while he remained behind. Some offered sympathy, others whispered about his strange behavior during the examinations, and a few suggested he was making excuses for poor performance. But Emeka, his closest friend, simply said, "Guy, I no understand everything way it happened, but I no say you be honest person. Whatever make you do this thing, you go make sense of the end." With a full year before he could attempt WAC again, Uche threw himself into a different kind of preparation. He began reading not just textbooks, but poetry, fiction, and philosophy, anything that might help him rebuild the parts of himself that had been lost. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to construct new memories and associations, like a sculptor working with broken clay, to create something beautiful from the fragments. 6 months into his gap year, Uche made a decision that would transform not only his own academic journey, but also impact the lives of many other students. He approached Principal Adigo with a proposal to establish an evening study circle for students struggling with their preparations for WAC. The idea was born from his intimate understanding of the desperation that could drive bright students to make terrible choices. The first meeting, held in a small classroom at Unity Secondary School, attracted only 5 students. But Uche's approach was different from traditional tutoring. Instead of simply drilling facts and formulas, he focused on study techniques, time management, and most importantly, helping students understand that academic success was a journey rather than a destination. He shared his own story, carefully edited to focus on the pressure and poor choices rather than supernatural elements, and encouraged others to be honest about their struggles. Word spread quickly about the study circle's effectiveness. Uche had developed innovative memory techniques and learning strategies during his own recovery process, methods that helped students retain information without the crushing anxiety he had once experienced. Within 3 months, the group had grown to over 30 students, representing several schools in the area. Teachers began to take notice, offering their expertise and resources to support the initiative. The irony was not lost on Uche that his greatest academic failure had led to his most meaningful educational contribution. By helping other students learn effective study methods, he was rebuilding his own confidence and discovering that teaching was as powerful as learning. The students who benefited from the study circle became living proof that there were alternatives to the desperation that had once driven him to Baba Ogun's compound. Success, he learned, was sweeter when it was shared and more meaningful when it was earned through honest effort. When WAC results were finally released a year later, Uche approached the notice board with calm acceptance rather than the frantic anxiety that had characterized his previous attempt. His scores were good, not perfect, but strong enough for university admission. More importantly, they represented genuine knowledge earned through patient study and honest effort. The memories he had built during his year of preparation, though different from what he had lost, were entirely his own. His mother wept when she saw the results, not just from pride in his academic achievement, but from joy at seeing her son whole again. The boy who had returned from his first WAC attempt had been hollow-eyed and disconnected. The young man who now stood before her radiated the quiet confidence that comes from knowing oneself completely. Adiz, now 14 and wise beyond her years, hugged him tightly and whispered, "Brother, your success sounds like music." The study circle that had begun as Uche's personal healing journey had evolved into a permanent institution at Unity Secondary School. Dozens of students had benefited from his teaching, and many had gone on to achieve their own academic goals through honest preparation. Principal Adagoke often remarked that Uche's greatest contribution to the school was not his eventual academic success, but his demonstration that failure could be transformed into service. As Uche prepared to begin his university studies, he visited his father's grave for the first time since losing the memory of his face. Though he could not remember the specific features that had once been so dear to him, he could feel his father's presence in his own character, in the integrity that had ultimately saved him from complete self-destruction. The true certificate, he realized, was not the paper that granted him university admission, but the wisdom he had gained through choosing honesty over expedience, service over self-interest, and authentic success over hollow achievement. His memories might be incomplete, but his character was whole, and that was a legacy worthy of his father's dreams. What do you think about Uche's choice? Would you risk losing your memories just to pass an exam? Drop your answer in the comments. I'll be reading them all. If this story touched you, hit like so more people see it. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful African folktales like this one. Your support keeps these stories alive.